Live. All right, welcome to the House Judiciary Committee this Wednesday morning, April 22nd, and we're turning back to S-193. So we have draft number 2.1, which incorporates some changes suggested, or actually, I don't think Judge Zone suggested the change. He suggested there needed to be a change. This is the stuff on page 2. But given his input, this is what Eric came up with to address Judge Zone's concerns, and then it also adds some of the recommended victims information. So those are the two changes from the last version. And the version was sent out to witnesses yesterday, and certainly I know that Karen and I think some of the others have not, some of the other witnesses have not given us input on the previous draft either. So we'll look for your input on where we are right now, and we'll turn it over to Karen. Thank you very much for being available this morning. I know you're out on vacation, and thank you for your willingness to weigh in on this. So I apologize for the delay, but over to you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. So for the record, Karen Barber, General Counsel of the Department of Mental Health. I did have a chance to look through the version that Nate sent yesterday. I think that it looks from the DMH perspective, and I want to allow time for DOC and Dale to weigh in if they had any issues. We haven't had a chance to kind of connect. But from the DMH perspective, it all looks fine. I appreciate the clarification on certain things that we had talked about, making it really clear that it's always the court that makes the ultimate decision on competency. I think there had been some concern in the past about who was making that determination. And so I think it makes it really clear here that it is the court. I appreciated the changes around some of the victims notification language. I want to defer to the state's attorney on those just to make sure that language really works for them. But from our perspective, victims, we had asked for some victim language to be added on this on the Senate side, and we think it is important that they have the ability to talk. So I didn't really have much on this version other than I appreciated the clarification on it. And so I really just wanted to be available in case there were questions or things you wanted to me to specifically comment on.
Are there questions for Karen? So I do have kind of one conceptual question. It's something that's been getting kicked around. I know this is on several different committees. Our work is really focused on sections 1 through 3, but some of the discussions certainly impact section 1 through 3. So when somebody is not restorable, I just want to make sure I understand this process. Somebody's not restorable, and one would look to see if they're dangerous by looking at their forensic risk assessment. And that would also guide the therapy that they might get to address the risks and such. But if we were to just go to, if some other states will do competency restoration, they'll determine the person's not restorable, and then they send them to the civil commitment process. And the way that presumably could look, well, I don't know if it could look this way, but in this bill, is one path is that we could have somebody's not restorable, they look at the forensic risk assessment, and then they are diverted to either the Act 248 process for if somebody is intellectual and developmentally disabled. They would be sent to the commitment for mental health. If that's the underlying reason for why they were deemed not competent. But then there's the question of where would somebody with a traumatic brain injury or dementia, I mean, is there an entity that presumably would be responsible for them? Would it be Dale in that scenario? And I'm not suggesting that this, I'm just trying to understand so that's one of the routes that presumably could have been taken, and instead, what this is trying to do in this bill is establish the equivalent process for this narrow set of individuals with the high needs and offenses that are very violent offenses But if you could just kind of comment on those different paths and why the path that we're trying to develop in here is equivalent and is appropriate. Did that question make sense? It was a long lead up question, but that's really a fundamental issue that a lot of the committees are looking at.
Sure. Yeah. So I think I'll say a couple things. So first, Vermont doesn't have any form of forensic system. And so it's really difficult to compare it to what happens in other states because they have whole systems, right? Like whole structures and commitment structures, facility structures designed to deal with individuals who are interacting with the criminal justice system. We don't have anything. And so we don't have a bunch of different kinds of types of civil commitment that you can put someone into when they're coming through this kind of criminal justice pathway. They just don't exist in Vermont. We have civil systems and we have criminal justice systems. In other states, they've got civil systems and criminal justice systems, and they're designed to go together, and the criminal justice systems are much larger. And so in Vermont, it is possible that someone who's coming out of the forensic facility or doesn't meet criteria to be in the forensic facility because they're not meeting that level of public danger could go into an Act 248 setting or go on an ONH. I think it's important to remember that those do have pretty strict clinical criteria because, again, they are not meant to be a catch-all for everyone. They are really meant, like in some other states, they're really designed to meet clinical need. And so there's high clinical thresholds for those. VDH has no form of custodial custody, right? So someone with primary substance use, that there is no custody, there is no option for those individuals on an involuntary basis. And if it's mental illness, an order of non-hospitalization is possible if they meet that clinical criteria. But again, ONHs are community-based programs, right? And so they really, they don't necessarily come with housing or 24/7 services. It's really, we're working with the DAs to help them get the services they need. The Act 248 under Dale is a pretty limited custody. And so I believe, and this is a better question for Dale, but it's not all intellectual developmental disabilities. It's a small subset of that. And so everyone else, again, there's no sort of custodial option for them. But of course, we're working with the designated agencies to get them services. So the way our systems are just so different that we're just not set up in the way that other states are. And we could, in the past, several years ago, we did come to the legislature with kind of this big, massive proposal, and we proposed a whole campus, and we had different levels of care, and that didn't get traction, and that's fine. Of course, that's a policy decision, but so that is an option for the future. But I think right now what we're trying to do is just really focus on a very narrow subset of individuals that would be in this. Without creating kind of the whole system around it, which I think is a much larger policy discussion about kind of in the future, maybe how you want this all to work, because we just don't have any sort of a system. Did that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, no, again, no, I appreciate that. No, thank you for the clarification. Other questions for Barbara?
So I sort of have a follow-up now from Martin's question. I mean, that is the way it is now, but the way it is now, we don't have anything, and we're trying to design what makes sense for the state. So the fact that the orders of non-hospitalization and the designated agencies have limited options and services isn't mandated by, there's nothing to prevent us from making that system more robust if that's the best way to go for the outcomes we want to achieve, as well as if we need a forensic facility and where that should be. Like, I just feel like it's not like, oh gosh, we can't do that because our Constitution doesn't allow it or the feds don't allow it. And when we do look at other states, that is what a lot of states are doing. And so we have the opportunity to benefit from looking at everyone else who's already gone before us and trying to carve the best way through.
Yeah, so I think what I would say is it's a yes and not an either or. So as we've talked about, this isn't purely a mental health issue. So thinking about how we can strengthen services in the community for those with mental health challenges is not going to solve this problem. Fundamentally, Vermont has made the decision that really values personal autonomy, and so these are high thresholds to put someone in voluntary care, right? And also the decision has been made that we were going to work to have hospitals that are licensed and accredited and follow all the high clinical criteria that every other hospital has to do, and not just have these big, massive state hospitals that are general fund and don't meet those things. So the way our system is designed, you can't just revoke an ONH and send someone to the hospital because they don't follow it. And so if that's kind of a model that is being considered, that would be a massive shift and a massive change and would require a lot of structural, statutory, policy, kind of real changes in the mental health system. And so I think, and again, that would only address part of it, but I think part of what we're trying to do is solve a very small problem. If you want to talk really big, how the whole mental health system operates, that's certainly something we can talk about, but you can't shift this one piece without impacting everything else if you're trying to use it that way.
So I'm not necessarily thinking of a major shift. I guess I'm thinking about a couple of things. One is the orders of non-hospitalization. If there are like residential community options, or even it's something in between. It's not necessarily being locked up in a forensic facility or a hospital ward, but it's the type of program that would be community-based, be small, and be sort of tailored to the needs of that person, much like some of the emergency bed and not exactly an emergency bed program because it's not that, but like the small, like we can do wraparound services for this person in the community and get good outcomes. And maybe I don't know enough about, like, is there some order that we'd have to have that's like an order of residential treatment or something that's not non-hospitalization and it's not commitment. I'm not sure about that. But the other part is when I think about the diverse population that we're talking about, like part of me is like, wouldn't it be better to not have everybody, the person with Alzheimer's, the person with a developmental disability, the person with a mental health challenge in the same forensic facility, but treated in their community in a program that's specialized to their particular needs?
Yeah, so I guess I'll answer your first question first, then I'll go to that. I mean, so there are residential programs that do already exist, right? And you can be on an ONH and in a residential program. Being on an ONH doesn't guarantee that you get placement because all of those are clinically based. And so if you need to be in a residential program, you're willing to go there, it fits for them. You have to apply, right? So we do have those settings already in our system, and those would continue to be available for folks. So yes, we do have those. In terms of your second question, I think there's this idea that everyone has to be served individually. But what I'll tell you now is that folks with all of these different needs are already being served together. They're already being served together in corrections environments. They're already being served together in mental health environments. They're already being served together in Dale environments. So most people have co-occurring, right? And it could change as to what the primary diagnosis is. And so that's kind of depending on which system they're interacting with the most. But certainly we have individuals at the hospital where we're trying to tease out, is this really mental illness or is this dementia? And they're in with everyone else, right? Or they have both an intellectual developmental disability and mental health and substance use, right? So all of these folks are already kind of interacting with our system. It's really kind of what is the primary diagnosis. And so if the primary diagnosis is substance use, they can't be in the hospital, but that doesn't mean they're not also getting outpatient mental health treatment. And so I think it's, to try to separate everyone ignores kind of the reality, which is that folks are really clinically complicated. And we are trying to meet them where they're at. And that does mean that everyone's kind of being treated together often.
Karen, are there any reports? I don't know. I don't really want to report, but could we look at what the outcomes are for those people? Like, how are the people who are already there in corrections doing? Are their issues improving? Are their families pleased with the care that they're getting versus the people that are in the hospital versus the people that you're saying are in residential treatment? Like, is there anything that looks at how that's going for everyone?
So you'd have to ask, DOC or Dale.
Right.
We don't do kind of I guess like customer satisfaction surveys when someone discharges from the hospital.
And not just customer service, but like improvement. If there is improvement or determination that there can't be improvement, like what does that happen faster in Dale than DOC?
So I don't know that you can compare those, right? Because we're doing different things. So in DMH, if someone discharges from the hospital, it means they've stabilized enough where they don't need to be in the hospital. I can't speak to the Act 248 program. In terms of corrections, they're not, that is kind of when they go in and when they go out, it's kind of led by the court, right? And so it's not based on their clinical. So I don't know that you're going to get data that talks about that just because it's a difference. I think it's really hard to compare all of these systems because right now they're doing very different things. There is a reporting requirement in the bill, which would kind of get to, I think, what you're getting at, which is once the forensic system is up and running, kind of looking at those types of things and getting you some of that data. It just doesn't exist now.
And if you don't have that kind of interaction with DOC now, why is that going to change?
So you were asking if people were satisfied with the care they're getting, which is very different from DMH having interactions with DOC around, okay, they have someone that they are wondering if is appropriate for hospital level care and us working with them to get them that care. So those are different things.
And again, the satisfaction part was more like if the relatives, like I was just trying to think about like people in hearing from our witness last week who represented both a victim and a family member of somebody who is charged. So like, I guess are the people being held in DOC now getting better if that's possible, or or the determination is being made that they cannot be restored? Like, I know DOC was saying we're doing this now. So part of me is like, what are they doing now and how's that going from the Department of Mental Health standpoint?
So we don't have competency restoration now, right? So no one's getting restored. So we can't kind of compare how that's going. We talk with DOC currently about people in their care, and from care management's perspective and from the department, yes, when they work with us and identify someone that needs services, WellPath is able, or whoever their contractor is at the time, right now it's WellPath, is able to get them services. They are getting a pretty. I know that they get a bad rap, and I get that, and I do think that WellPath is doing a good job at providing services in the correction system. I'll tell you that I'm on a couple national boards, a National Attorneys Group and a National American Association of Public Health and Human Services. And when I talk to other states about how our DOC is an AHS, people's minds are blown, right? Like that no one else does this, where the Department of Corrections is so integrated into human services. And to hear about the programs that our facilities have, I know that it's a correction setting, but we really are so far ahead of other states. And I think we kind of lose track of that. And so I do think that WellPath is able to provide these services. Is it perfect? No, but no system is perfect. I would say the DAs aren't giving perfect services either. It's just not possible, right? And so I do think that DOC, when we're saying they're doing things already, they're treating these people already, right? People are able to get access to psychiatry. They are able to get on medications. They are able to do groups. They are able to do therapy. And so those are things that are happening now. I think this model is to increase that, to give them even more in the competency restoration realm, to add that on to the clinical, because again, competency restoration isn't clinical. And then for folks that are found not restorable or not guilty by reason of insanity, continue to give them the treatment they need, kind of based on that risk assessment to determine how they can go out into the community. Those are things that aren't happening now. Right now, they're just getting kind of maintenance, right? Like, what do they need right now? This is really focused on how do we go beyond that and add more to that.
Okay, so I've got a few follow-up questions, and one is with our system of care that's delivered through our designated agencies, our preferred providers, etc. It isn't ideal now, but we're not saying what can we do to make that a better system. When Commissioner Murad was in, he talked about that he would contract with WellPath to do this service, and he mentioned Massachusetts. So I started looking at Massachusetts. They ended their contract with WellPath very recently because they were not pleased with it. So I'm not sure what Commissioner Murad had in mind, but that was confusing. And I'm wondering, I know that's a very pricey contract, and part of me is like, have we thought about investing $5 million, whatever that is, in supporting our Vermont providers, or bringing in, like, sort of buy local? Like, couldn't we work to help this morning on the way in, Vermont Public was doing a story about primary care doctors that barely hanging on and our shortage of medical people. If we were not looking to a big outside state contract, it could be a win-win is one thing that I'm wondering about.
So before we go there, that's getting way outside our jurisdiction.
Okay, all right.
Because I know that the Joint Justice Oversight and Corrections and Institution have been looking at WellPath or bringing it in-house, and they did that with lots of extensive testimony. And so that's really ultimately the corrections decision. So I know we need to understand somewhat where the back end of this is and the concerns that may be there with DOC or WellPath, but that ultimately is really corrections jurisdiction.
Yes, but I feel like the Department of Mental Health is going to be like an innocent bystander and not have a lot of, like, wait a minute, we could be doing this, which is another reason why I know that's not in our jurisdiction either, to move it out of DOC. And I've got to say, somebody in our committee said this the other day, and I just want to reiterate it. That's what DOC, worked in the field in Michigan for 13 years before being in Vermont. And while it's remarkable that DOC is in AHS, we still have the silos, and having had contracts at the same time with AHS, mental health, ADAP and DCF, like, it felt like different worlds and different departments. So I'd love to see more integration, and I know that's a vision the secretary has. So I look forward to that happening.
No, I appreciate your concern, but just
no, thanks.
want to stick to our lane. Ian.
Karen, I just have one question, and I'm trying just to going back to kind of the beginning of the bill and trying to follow an individual going through the process. If we've got somebody who is in the forensic facility because they're not currently on an order of hospitalization because they don't qualify as a person in need of treatment, if while they're in the forensic facility, they suddenly become someone who qualifies as a person in need of treatment, would they then be like ordered, have an order of hospitalization request made? Like, or is the hope that the forensic facility would also handle someone if they moved into that sort of realm?
Yeah, that's a great question. No. This facility would not be a hospital level of care. If
Oh.
someone needs the hospital, they would go to the hospital. So we already have folks trained within DOC to kind of start the process, which is there's a 3-step process to kind of come into DOH custody involuntarily. So we have folks that are able to do kind of the first 2 levels, and then a psychiatrist would look at them. But absolutely no, if someone decompensated to the point where they needed hospital level of care, we would work to quickly get them to a hospital unit to stabilize them, and then this would be their discharge plan. That happens now in corrections, so we do
Yep.
have folks that are coming in and out of our system as needed based on clinical needs.
And so that would happen, you know, the person's in the forensic facility, they're doing the work as laid out in the bill, and then there could be an sort of assessment done, and then there's a realization this is now a person who needed treatment. And yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely. Yep, and that is the goal. We always want people to access the hospital when they need it.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for Karen? All right, well, thank you very much, Karen. Appreciate you being available this morning.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
All right, we'll go to Susan Aronoff, can join us next. Thank you for being here again.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, and so really the focus, I want to kind of try to keep on our lane, in our lane.
Yeah.
It's still use section 1 through 3, and it's the process that's set out in those sections. Really, it's mainly 1 and 3, actually, are the 2 sections, so.
Okay, so that's helpful. I have some overarching concerns, and then I have some comments on this.
Perfect. Yeah, if you identify.
So for the record, Susan Aronoff, and I do the policy work for the Vermont Developmental Disabilities Council. And I'll do the short version of I am an employee of the Agency of Human Services. However, I work for a federally funded council, the Developmental Disabilities Council, and we operate under a memorandum of understanding so that I am free to advocate on behalf of people with disabilities and their family members and speak to legislators or anyone else about matters of public policy and take positions and make public statements that are different than the agency's official position. And just so you guys know, not all state employees can do that. In fact, most state employees operate under personnel policies that expressly prohibit that. So I always want to be really careful to, when I'm here, be clear, I'm not speaking for AHS. That said, I have some real concerns that have not been addressed in this newest draft. And that has to do with, so Barry Commoner, the old environmentalist, had this saying, there's no out there. Now, he was speaking about, you know, trash and like that. But I just want to say, in terms of the people that we're trying to move around in our system, to the Agency of Human Services, it's a problem that there's no out there. Because if we were to learn any single lesson from the debacle and the tragedy and the horror of Woodside, and I hope some of you have read that article or at least scanned it, we would know there's got to be an out there. In the rulemaking process that's set up in here, in the oversight, in everything, it's all AHS. AHS is going to get together and come up with the rules about quality and oversight and staffing levels, and AHS is going to supervise how it's going. So you've got corrections, you've got Department of Mental Health, you've got Dale. They're all in AHS. I worked there, and there is a mantra, agency of one. And sometimes that works when you want no wrong door to public benefit programs and you want to break the silos. But to Representative Rachelson's point, there are still a lot of silos. Anyway, it's an agency. There's no out there. There needs to be independent oversight. Because it's not going to be a hospital, you won't even have the benefit, we, the people of Vermont, the people in that in those confines.
I'm a little confused by what you mean, there's no out there.
There's no one else
I think I know what you
outside.
mean.
There's no one outside the system looking in, able to be exercise independent oversight from outside the Agency of Human Services.
I'm glad I asked because,
Okay.
yeah.
And just getting back to what I mentioned earlier, as far as our lane, and
Yes.
I think all these things are concerns to us generally speaking, but I'm really
Yes.
focused on
Yes,
section 1 and 3, which
yes.
isn't really gonna, I mean,
Okay,
all that, it has actually court oversight of all that process. Or most of the process, some things in there that's not the case,
yes.
and we'd like your input on that. But the
Okay.
oversight and all that is really being handled in 3 other committees and
Or not. So, okay, can I just say another thing as someone who's worked in this building a lot? I'm trying to follow the conversations. And what I want to say at the start is my written comments, I'm going to send you at the end of the day because I want them to be responsive to the questions and concerns that committee members have raised. And I don't see Representative Arsenault here today, but when she asked, well, what are other states doing? That's a really good question. And sometimes I'm able to provide some answers. So I really am looking forward to the testimony today from the Commissioner Bowen, but trying to follow this conversation as it's happening in corrections and institutions and human services and here, it's hard to know. Thank you for the lanes of this is section 1 to 3, but the sections are very interconnected. And when you're a person going through the process, you're touched by, you can potentially be touched by these departments. As to your section, a specific thing in section 1 that I would suggest, where you're excluding people in B. So it's the section where a person shall be remanded and
What page, what line are you on?
page 1
okay.
Yeah.
in the sort of lines 17 to 19
Okay.
section.
Yeah. Perfect.
I would also add that if the person, I would add probably a new clause saying that if the person is currently under Act 248, and when the Commissioner of Bail is here, you can ask her what that means. Who's under Act 248? How did they get there? How long do they stay? But if someone is under the supervision, under Act 248 now, I think they could be excluded from the start. If someone could come under the jurisdiction of Act 248 in the future.
So can I just ask, just
Yeah.
follow up with that? Isn't that more of the equivalent for subsection 3 there?
Yes,
So in 3, it's saying if the person has an order of hospitalization, then this doesn't apply. It could also be if a person is under the jurisdiction of Act 248, it might not apply.
you're right. That's where looking at my notes.
Okay, so that's a good question for Dr. Bowen as well. So thank you
Yes.
for pointing that out,
For Act 248.
because it's kind of the equivalent for the IDD population as an order of hospitalization, kind of.
It is. Yes, that would be what I would say.
Thank you.
And I also just want to say that the Act 248 process is confusing and flawed and it's all right. But if I can just piggyback on what Representative Rachel was saying about possible alternatives, because I don't deny that that there are people who pose a risk, public safety risk, who are in the community and then end up in a correctional facility and no one knows what to do with them. I think sometimes in this building, people want to know what other states are doing. And sometimes it's like, don't tell me what they do in Connecticut. I don't know with this committee and with this issue, which way it is. I just want to say that there are some things that we've been doing in Vermont that have been working. Prior to COVID, we had 3 crisis houses in the developmental disability system that worked for the people on Act 248 to stabilize them if they needed a higher level of care or children. During Act 248, those 3 houses filled up and there was a backlog. I could think, why not 4 or 5 or 6? I think, I don't know if it's your purview to say what should be in the interim report or not. But where you have the sections about cost or startup cost, I would really like someone to ask. This is on the very last page in Coren's 4, an anticipated timeline for the development of a forensic facility, including preliminary cost estimates and initial operation. Could we also know the annual cost per person? And could we also know the cost of some less restrictive alternatives? Like a state-funded housing voucher, like some state-constructed secure housing on state property. Could we direct BGS to identify buildings on state grounds that can be secure, locked residential facilities? That is what they do in other states. They sometimes call them cottages. But you look at the campus in Waterbury, there was a lot of housing there. It can be secured. We haven't done it.
Can I ask a question? So have you testified in corrections and institutions yet? Or have you been set up to testify there?
Yeah, yes, and I'm going back, I'm there tomorrow.
Yeah, because I just want to make sure that, I mean, I'm noting this, but that they're probably the ones
Yes, and
making modifications to that
yes.
part. And I think I've already heard them talk about just these kind of things you just mentioned as well.
So again,
Yeah, I understand. So
it
just,
must be harder for you guys to follow even, so, you know, I take out my violin. It's a really complicated issue with lots of pieces and you're in all these, you know, this part's in your committee, and this part's in the other.
right.
And I'm sure you're saying it's all connected.
It is connected and really the driving of this bill is this committee and corrections and institutions. It's like healthcare and human service are weighing in on narrower parts, but
Yeah.
it's making sure that you're being heard in the right committees as well.
Yes, and I just want to say, I'm also going to be going back to human services because there's this human services component of this, which is our current designated and specialized service agencies who provide mental health treatment in the community. They don't have a forensic rate. They don't have forensic treatment specialists. They're not paid to do that. And they can't even find work. Our clients get, one study says 55% of the hours they need. If you want to keep people stable in the community, give them the services they need. Pay the service workers enough to do that work. But with forensic work, pay them more. It's a more dangerous, it's specialized, and we don't have that in our community-based system, whether that's housed at corrections or DMH. I don't have that opinion, but we could really use community-based treatment specialists. People on ONHs, keep people safe.
Agree with that. Yes.
And I think that's human services, not you guys.
Yes.
So I'd be happy to, I will submit written questions, comments. I really do benefit a lot from listening to the questions you ask other witnesses to try to understand, you know, what's top of mind for you and what would be most helpful for me as a witness. And I really appreciate it. This committee really seems like it's listening to the witnesses and making changes and drafts as you go along. So as a witness, you can't ask for anything more.
I appreciate that. So any questions for Stephen related to the really primarily section 1 and 3? Yeah, fine.
So I'm wondering if in your written testimony later, if you are suggesting like amend language changes in those sections.
Yes, actually, I just realized one of the sections I most wanted to comment on is in this section. So on page 3, lines 8, really this critical population of people whose competency cannot be restored. First of all, I think holding someone for 60 days after that finding is just way too long. We're depriving people of their constitutional right to liberty. The state is holding someone involuntarily, depriving them of liberty. We say 60 days, and then that period could be extended for good cause. I just think it should be like within 72 hours, period. I mean, how long do you want to be in a facility you're not supposed to be in, deprived of your basic right to freedom and liberty? So that section. But I really think that what happens in general for people whose competency cannot be restored is still not adequately addressed here. You will have people from day one, the people with dementia, the people with acquired brain injury, traumatic brain injuries, the people with certain intellectual and developmental disabilities whose competency will not be able to be restored. They need safe, secure housing in the least restrictive setting from day one, that plan, and that is not accounted for in this yet. So that's, I don't know how many people that'll be of these, but I do think from a human rights perspective and from a cost-effective perspective, we don't need to hold people in the most expensive settings who are never going to be restored.
Right, so, and I always tie this back to this very limited population we're talking about where they're being held, they're being detained, pending trial and such, being held without bail because there's been a weight of the evidence hearing and the guilt, the evidence of guilt is great and the evidence of the danger is great. So that I kind of work into, whether this is a reasonable amount of time. So I understand what you're saying, but I always have to kind of keep, if this was somebody being held on a misdemeanor and which it probably wouldn't be because
This is really where I really miss Representative Donahue's good brain, because she could tell me how many crimes there are out there that have this life sentence, and it's not what we think the barrier is. And I never, even when I practiced law, I never practiced criminal law, so sentencing and those things, I wouldn't even say. But I think that what happens with people is sometimes they have outbursts of dangerousness behavior, and then what? They're going to be held in a prison for life. That's what this could lead to for someone with an intellectual and developmental disability. That's just does not seem acceptable to me at this stage. So that's.
so and I think, and I guess if we could comment on if this language needs to be strengthened some, I'm trying to find where it is, where specifically the court has to look at the least.
Yeah, page 4, line 9.
You're fine.
Well, because I have a little note saying the court shall order the treatment of the person in least restricted setting. And I put where? Like, we don't have secure, that's what we need to develop in our system. Housing, what I spend most of my time in this building doing is trying to create service supported housing for adults with intellectual disabilities. We are 600 units minimum short just for that population to live in stable, secure housing. 40% are in adult foster care, the most unstable form of housing you could find. We call it shared living, used to work, call Airbnb, so much now, but least restrictive setting sounds good on paper.
Sure.
So the other thing that I said, the other thing that's I circled on this page, that I just want to say, I found kind of like a problematic wording that's throughout this bill is everything is predicated on a finding that the person is no longer suffering from a qualifying condition. For these categories of conditions that I'm talking about, that they will always be suffering. I don't particularly like the word suffering. They will always be living with a qualifying condition. So the key is really the risk assessment. So I could go through and in my comments, maybe I will, all the places where that appears. But that's the first part of the findings that need to be made in many sections, is that they're no longer suffering from this condition. Well, they are always going to have that condition. So the question then becomes, are they dangerous or not?
Well, I think that's the way it's supposed to be. I think it reads this way. The key is that it's a qualifying condition that upon the person's release would create a substantial risk of bodily injury. It's the fact that that condition is underlying that substantial risk of bodily injury.
But they're always going to have, so for people with acquired brain injury, dementia, intellectual disability, they are always going to have that condition. You could strike that clause, that what you really want to know is the person upon release create a substantial risk of bodily injury to another person?
Do you need to have it attached to the qualifying condition? And I think maybe do. So I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
Ian, go ahead.
Oh, I'm just thinking about it. No, I think you do need to have the qualifying condition. So we're on page 4, line 15 through 18. This is like a release valve for someone who has been.
Or it's also on line 5.
Line 5. It's throughout the document.
More than one place.
Yeah. So they're held in least restrictive means because they have a qualifying condition, and that because of the qualifying condition, they are substantial risk of bodily injury to another person. So if you got rid of the qualifying condition and just had it be about substantial risk to another person, that actually broadens it extensively, right? And you probably could hold somebody longer.
For the group of people that I'm talking about, they are always going to have the qualifying condition. So if someone has to be free of a qualifying condition.
But that's not, sorry.
To move on. And if there's even a possible interpretation that they would need to be free of the qualifying condition to move on.
And that's very helpful because that's not how I understood this to work. That they can have the qualifying condition, but if they're no longer found due to that qualifying condition to create a substantial risk of bodily injury to another person, they would then be like, that's the release. So they can continue to have the qualifying condition.
For the people that I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So that's the thing. You're creating a similar process for people who can be restored to competency, and therefore they might not be suffering from the qualifying condition that led them to be incompetent to begin with. And people who will always have the qualifying condition that led them to be incompetent to begin with. And you're trying to have language that's going to address restoration for the people who are restorable, and for the people who aren't restorable, you just kind of have to figure out how it would apply to them.
Okay, yeah, so I think that's a question you can ask some of the other works, just to see how other folks are interpreting that. Right, yeah, I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think the one on line 15, starts on line 15 is probably the one that's like the wonkiest to me, but there were other places where that appeared. So the other language on page 5, in beginning on 3 and on 6, those two clauses. This is about the court shall order the release of the person under prescribed regimen, order an explicit condition that they comply with these things. And what I would just say, because these are going to be court orders that really impinge upon constitutional rights, the decision of what we put in our bodies in terms of medication and involuntary medication, that's been recognized by the United States Supreme Court to be a liberty interest. So there's no end. So my question here was like, for how long? Forever? And you're basically here creating another form of like an order of non-hospitalization, again, outpatient commitment order, which is fine. I love outpatient commitment orders. They're really useful tools. They just need to have all the due process bells and whistles that an order that would constrain someone's liberty would have, like annual reviews or that's.
Thank you for explaining that out. Yeah.
Right. I'm done, and I will
Yeah, no, that's very helpful, that last point.
Yeah.
I want to be helpful. I don't want to just keep sitting here and saying, nope, not kidnapped. I do want to be helpful.
So I've got 2 other questions. It looks like in terms of do other states allow indefinite time allowed for restoration competency? It sounds like a third of the states have indefinite commitment. for competency restoration to happen, but that the other 60% have imposed like an end date, like with any, like Washington State, I found for, first degree felonies. I'm trying to find the language to match what we're trying to target here, was 1 year. And I'm just trying to look to see what other states offer.
Yes.
The other piece of it is how often the reporting needs to happen. We have it as 6 months now, which seems to be, a lot of states have like every 45 days or every 60 days. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts about those two issues.
So those are excellent questions. And I think that in general, that the approaches for competency restoration and how long do you hold a case open, the systems that I think are kind of split the difference between the public interest in holding someone accountable for a crime and the personal interest in being free of the free system. I think the states that look at the heinousness of the crime, and for certain crimes will have an indefinite callback. So for certain degrees of murder, if that person ever restores competency 20 years after the fact, they can be held accountable. And then in others, if it's, X number of months of the maximum of what they would have served had they been competent for the crime, seems to split the difference of like, if society would hold a person without a disability responsible for this amount of time, why are we holding a person with a disability for twice or 10 times as long? And part of that is a civil liberties concern. And I will say, honestly, having been around these issues in Connecticut, it becomes a cost concern as well, especially people who can be managed as safely in community settings. They're expensive beds. That's why I think getting some of these cost figures before we go down this route is really important.
And I've noticed a couple of states have like a transition plan put in place, which is something Vermont isn't doing, obviously.
Yes.
But could make a big difference.
Transition plans, and I'll say the state that I'm most familiar with is Connecticut, and we kind of have this oversight board that is set up specifically. It's called the Psychiatric Security Review Board, the PSRB. It has mental health professionals, it has legal. It is set up specifically to review annually the people under its purview, whether they're in the community or in institutional settings. And it's that board that determines their next level of movement. And victims get to participate. It's really a lovely thing.
And is that independent, like when you're talking about the out, are they independent of the department providing the service?
So what has happened, yes and no, is and Connecticut, after the recent scandals, I think they've done it, reversed it yet again, is they have maintained some lines of separation between the Department of Mental Health and the operation of their forensic facility. And they've had a different Whiting Forensic Division and the Whiting Forensic Facility. Then they put it under the purview of the Commissioner of Department of Mental Health. And I'd be lying if I said I knew where it landed now. But they tend, in terms of the separation, they operate as a hospital. And that is just so important because that means the Joint Commission and CMS and other hospital-like entities get to come in also. So, and then in terms of the representation of legal aid, that's one thing I want to say. I would just try to make clear that people also get representation from the Office of Prisoners' Rights, and then also have access to the advocates from the protection and advocacy systems, the disability rights system. Now, they might have automatic statutory access authority, they probably do, but it's so much easier to just have it written into the statute because outside eyes.
Sure. So if the DOC were required to run it as a hospital, then they would have to get it accredited and then we'd have to.
Yes. I think so.
It would make,
I know that one of the things that Representative Donahue was working on was trying to get some of the psychiatric hospital stuff, some of the Green Mountain Care Board stuff to apply to
Yes, she talked about
people in Vermont, and I don't know enough about where these things landed.
Any other questions?
You know what, though? I can try to find that out.
I don't know if it's a question for the witness.
Okay.
Yeah. So,
Ask the question.
yeah, I have one thought, and I'm just wondering how bad of an idea this would be. What if so I'm realizing what would really be helpful is a flow chart of all the different people. But if you had someone who, okay, they are incompetent, they have a qualifying condition, they now are not found to have a substantial risk. So now they're in this like weird place where we can order. What if we just said, once they got to that point, they now are a qualifying person, need of treatment pursuant to 18 VSA 7101, and they just bump into that stream.
So the person in need of treatment stuff is on the mental health side of the universe. And I deal with people with
Okay,
developmental and intellectual disabilities.
so not really.
There are co-occurring,
Yeah,
but
so you couldn't really. Yeah.
so I feel like I'm not in a good enough
Fair
position.
enough.
That's right.
Well, thank you very much for the testimony. We'll look at your written testimony as well. And we will take a break until 10:30. We have Eric and a few other witnesses at that point.